Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Megan Moeller, a productivity enthusiast at ActivTrak and your cruise director of sorts for today. I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording today's session and we will send it out by tomorrow at the latest. We do hope to have a few minutes for questions if time allows. So if you do have any, go ahead and pop them into the Q&A below in the bottom nav as we go along. And if we're able to get to them, then we will. We maybe have 5 minutes max for questions. So hopefully we can get to those. And with that, welcome to today's session, Maximizing Workforce Potential, Lessons from Echo Global Logistics and ActivTrak. I'd like to invite our two speakers on as I introduce them. First, we have Scott Friesen. Scott currently leads the analytic and data science function at Echo Global Logistics. Hi, Scott. A leading provider of technology-enabled transportation and supply chain management services, and they are also a customer of ActivTrak. He serves as an advisor to an artificial intelligence startup company and is amongst the most sought-after members of the expert network for the International Institute of Analytics. Prior to joining the Echo leadership team, he held analytics and insights leadership roles at Best Buy, Ulta Beauty, and Drumline, formerly Quadratic. Outside of his immediate responsibilities, he enjoys teaching on the topics of applied analytics and fighting in numeracy wherever he can. He holds a Master of Business Administration from Columbia Business School in New York and a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Swarthmore College. And we have Gabriella Mauk, ActivTrak's Chief Customer Officer and head of our Productivity Lab. She is responsible for customer value, expansion, and growth, as well as overseeing our world-class productivity thought leadership team. As an expert in organizational effectiveness, leadership, and design, she's spent the last 10 years helping a wide variety of organizations build outcome-oriented, performance-driven teams. Previous roles include helping McDonald's stand up its first organizational effectiveness and leadership center of excellence, as well as positions in human capital and strategy consulting firms, including McKinsey & Co. and KPMG. And now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gabriella, who is going to actually lead our discussion and take us through everything today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you for everyone joining. This is a really exciting discussion that I'm looking forward to. Scott, I think, I can't thank you enough. We have immense gratitude for you participating in this session, but beyond that, just the impact that you and Echo have had on our roadmap and on the way that we think as an organization. So thank you. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
I want to start with probably the most basic of questions, right? And just do a kind of a warm up here. Would love if you could share with those on the call, a little bit about Echo, employee size, locations, mission. Would love if you could kind of just open us up with that foundation.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. So I'm sitting here in Chicago. Echo is headquartered in Chicago. We're about 3,000 people in our organization. We're about between 4 and 4.5 billion in revenue, to give you a sense of size. We are privately held by private equity right now. We were formerly a public company on NASDAQ, but we were taken private a little over 3 years ago. And we have a lot of locations. So Chicago is our headquarters and our largest office, but we have about a dozen locations throughout the country. We have offices in Nashville, Dallas, Detroit, Twin Cities in Minnesota, Southern California, et cetera. So we are definitely spread out in terms of our workforce. Some of those were organically founded offices, and some of those were acquisitions that we made over the years and sort of tucked into our organization. And for those of you that don't know what a 3PL is, or a third-party logistics provider, it means we move freight. So we're in the transportation business, we move freight, but we don't actually own trucks ourselves. We play matchmaker between people who need to move goods and carriers that need freight on their trucks. So that's what we do.
Awesome. And I think that's a great segue. I mean, when we think about your type of industry and where you sit, highly cyclical, one would imagine, right? And so I would love to use that as kind of a pivot point, a largely cyclical industry, really trying to better understand how you allocate your workforce when there are times of imbalance. So enter ActivTrak, right? And leveraging our data, presumably with other data as well, to manage that cyclicality and that allocation of resources. Do you mind sharing a little bit about where ActivTrak came into the picture in that mix?
Sure. Yeah, there's sort of there were two challenges as I saw it that I was looking to solve when we first reached out to you guys and to some competitors when we were sort of shopping around and looking for what solution we wanted. The first was that I was listening to tough but fair questions from my boss, our president, COO, of our CIO at the time about technology enhancements that were coming out and whether or not they were making a difference to employee productivity. And there are a lot of things that are hard about that measurement, but we invest a tremendous amount in building our own technology. We also work with third parties, of course, but the core of our technology set is all homegrown. And so as new features come out in our technology, a bunch of those are intended to make our workforce more productive, more efficient. And we weren't seeing that in the sort of just, loads per person per day measure. The
Mm.
trouble is that there's a lot of measurement slippage that happens between individual tasks and total volume. Because as you point out, some of the volume per person per day is driven by productivity. Some of it's driven by the market, and there's not anything we can do about that.
Right.
So it was a very difficult thing to measure. And we have a tremendous amount of our workforce that does switch tasking all day long. So they're working on this on some invoicing, and then they get a ping from a client, and now they get a pivot, and they got to like answer that client's thing, and then they're going to switch back. And so there's a lot of switching that's going on all the time. That makes time measurement very, very challenging. So when IT rolls out just this one particular part of the widget that's better, knowing whether or not it was faster or not is very challenging measurement. So that was one challenge that I was hearing that was aggravated by the cyclicality. The second that I was listening to was debates between our finance organization and our operations organization on headcount. And this sort of gets more directly to your question, which is how do we know if we have the right number of people? And basically, you've got sort of a lot of storytelling happening in both directions. So you've got sales saying, oh, we've got all these clients, they're very demanding. They need this, they need that, they need all this stuff. And oh, by the way, the market conditions are thus and such. And as a result, we need more people. Finance is looking at productivity measures and saying, how many loads are people moving or how many different tasks are they doing? And they're saying, yeah, I don't think that you do based on this. And then sales comes back and says, no, but you don't understand. The reason why those productivity levers numbers are what they are is because this client is more challenging. They are more time consuming. And again, there's always this kind of like, yeah, but the market impacts that. And so I'm looking at that whole situation. In both of those cases, I'm saying, well, we could actually know the answer if we knew time. If we actually knew how much time people were spending doing specific tasks, but also how much overall time they're working, it would solve for that. And that's been sort of the breakthrough that we've had since we've implemented ActivTrak. And it allows much more data-driven decisions on the staffing front rather than as much sort of what I refer to as sort of the storytelling and the back and forth. There's been a lot more clarity on that.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit, I'm going to poke at that a little bit more. Tell me a little bit about how that works in the everyday, right?
Yeah.
There were probably a lot of people on this call that were like, yes, that's why I bought ActivTrak, and that was the value proposition that I was all about.
Yeah.
And so I think illuminating sort of how does that work, right? So function comes, says that they need 4 more headcount. The market, for all of the reasons you just outlined, can you kind of
Yeah.
detail how that unfolds?
Yeah. Well, again, I'll contrast how it used to unfold and how it's unfolding now.
Right.
In the past, before we had ActivTrak visibility, we were using a bunch of proxies for time, right? These KPIs, which are like sort of task accomplishment levels, but the variation in how long those tasks take is very wide by person, by account, by market condition, by all these things. And so that's why it was such a messy measure. And ultimately, what I think would happen is finance would relent often. Like they would question, they would push back, but at the end of the day, sales and operations generates our revenue, generates our gross profit. So is finance really going to risk that?
Right.
So a lot of times, ultimately, sales would get the incremental headcount they need. Now what's happening is we've provided reporting to both sides. Like one of the things I'm a big believer in is like you end up with sort of corporate conflicts when people aren't looking at the same information and sort of reading off the same playbook. And so now what's happening is the finance guy who's going to engage in that conversation can see the ActivTrak numbers. He can see the active productive hours per day by business unit or by team or by individual. And so can the sales or operations leader. And so now what's happening is either the sales or operations leader isn't even asking, because when they need that one incremental person, we had a senior vice president of our Chicago office had a sales rep that was completely drowning in the amount of work that she had grown her business very successfully. She's saying, I need operations support. I want to actually give back some of my accounts to other people if I can't get operations support.
Mhm.
And so he's going, oh my gosh, like we don't want that. She's doing a great job. We want to give her operation support. But what he knew is he didn't even ask finance for the backfill because he's looking at other parts of his organization. He's saying, I got some really underutilized people that don't have enough work to keep them busy all the time. And so he was basically able to reallocate headcount between two of his division vice presidents that
Two
are under.
like roles. Yeah.
Yeah. And so basically there was excess capacity over here that wasn't over here, and he was able to move it over. And so that's just like one very specific story that I know has happened as a result of the ActivTrak data and insights,
Mhm.
um, where essentially we didn't end up adding a headcount in that case. And as a result of being able to know where there was excess capacity and reallocate that. So like it's going to be that story
Mhm.
over and over and over and over again. So like you and I talked the other day about, what do we think this is worth? We've already gotten over $600,000 now of labor savings, and that number is just going to continue to grow as we have case after case where we have to be nimble and adjust to market conditions, adjust to client needs, and do that. But we're better able to know where we have capacity and where we don't have capacity.
Mhm. What I love about that story, and I'm going to ask you to kind of, bring it back at Echo org wide, is you brought relief to someone who needed it, right? I think it's, and could then perform their job better, and opportunity to someone who also needed it, right? The ability
Yeah,
to better align them to the work that they should be doing, and give them the opportunity to really shine, perhaps where they weren't.
yeah,
You know, one of the things that I think is I've admired so much about your implementation of ActivTrak is a lot of focus on activity and tasks and outputs and inputs, but also a really high level of respect for your workforce, right? And
yeah,
so, it's something that I just think is, not mutually exclusive, right? And in fact,
yeah,
critical to the success. I mean, talk me through a little bit about how employees perceive your implementation and use of the solution for things like these.
yeah. So Echo is now the company I've worked at the longest other than Best Buy. And even though they're in very different industries, Best Buy is retail and Echo's transportation, something they have in common that I've loved about working both places is this really deep cultural respect for the frontline employee. Like at Best Buy, there is this, or there was at the time when I was there, this deep respect for the folks that are working on the sales floor at the store, right? We called them blue shirts. It was like, and I always loved that about that culture. And Echo is very similar. We don't have stores, but we've got these folks that are, on the phone all day long trying to, help our shippers and contact carriers. And there's just a tremendous amount of hustle that I really respect about that. Um, and the mindset of the leadership is those folks are essentially paying our bills, paying our salaries. Like that's where the revenue and the gross profit comes from. And so Best Buy sort of had that mindset, and Echo has that mindset. And so it's one of the things I love about working here. When it comes to ActivTrak, what that means ultimately is respecting them enough to be open about the fact that we're doing this. That's been something that I thought was a critical hallmark of our implementation, and it's been something that we've been true to throughout, which is we're not hiding the fact that we're doing this. We're open about it, and we will take the time to explain how the system works to anyone that wants to know, right? We've given some basic briefings, but if folks want to go deeper and understand it more deeply, they certainly can. We've also been really explicit about the first response to seeing some numbers that look really low should be to seek to understand. right? The first response is like, oh my God, what the hell are you doing? That is like, that is not the response. Because what we find is we've had some employees that are thought very highly of that actually have very low productive active hours. In other words, put another way to put it out of ActivTrak, parlance, they just don't have essentially a full-time job. Like they're putting in like half days, and yet the feedback about that person is incredibly positive.
Mhm.
So this is, I've had leaders coming and be like, I'm so surprised this person is like such low hours. And I said, well, let's talk about that for a second. One of the reasons they're getting positive feedback is that they are incredibly responsive. So when someone contacts them, they get back to them immediately and they resolve whatever the issue is immediately because they've got time to do it. And it's not that person's fault that they don't have enough work to do. That's on us as management to give them more work. So that's those are some of the dialogues that have been happening. And then the last thing I'd say is just in terms of the cultural or the mindset, it's very easy for something like this to become sort of management versus employee kind of that's the risk of it is that you can end up in that sort of contentious um, circumstance. And I think that's really destructive to culture. And one of the things I've talked about openly is when people are like, hey, like this doesn't seem, if folks feel uncomfortable with the idea that like management is monitoring this or what have you, I'll just point out, I'll just ask them in simplest terms. So you know that we have a hybrid workforce. Sometimes you're working at home, sometimes you're working in the office. How would you feel about the fact that you are putting in 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, you're doing your job, and someone else on your team is putting in 4 hours a day, 5 days a week? Are you okay with that? And of course, the immediate answer is no. I'm like, so this isn't really about management versus employee. This is about fairness across the workforce that everybody's pulling the load. And one of our sort of cultural or one of our company values is carry the load together. That's like one of the things that we try to espouse. And so this idea that you've got some people sort of doing full-time work and other people that are not, that are in the same exact role, receiving the same compensation, really doesn't sit right with folks rightfully. And so that's one of the things that we also talk about to say, hey, this is about making sure that if someone's like burning really hot and they've got too much on their plate and someone else doesn't have enough, we can reallocate some of that work.
Mhm. You know, I spend a lot of time working with organizations and coaching them at the onset of their journey about the fact that underutilization doesn't equate to some sort of nefarious, intent, right?
Right.
Underutilization could be a manager who doesn't quite know how to allocate the work,
That's right.
an individual who doesn't understand the purpose of how their work aligns to the strategy. And so I think it's a good segue on something that I wanted to touch upon, which is Echo's pursuit of going beyond how many productive hours you work, which is a great overarching metric, but
Hmm.
then moving into what activities are you doing that we believe will, for your role, drive to the best result. And so
Yeah.
we call that activity alignment, right? And
Yeah.
so curious if you could, share a couple examples or perhaps some of the work you're doing on better understanding how roles are working on the right things using the ActivTrak data.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing I'll say is that one of the directors that was quite enthusiastic about getting this information. One of his first insights is he had an individual on his team who looked like that person was putting in fewer hours. But in terms of the task KPIs that I was talking about, like the things, the tasks they were accomplishing were just as high as everybody else. So he looks at that and he says, so this person appears to be accomplishing just as much as everybody else, but is doing it in like 2/3 of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings about a really interesting question, right? Sort of philosophical question about work, which is like, are you paying for the widget production or are you paying for the time? Right. And we've had some of those explicit conversations internally. Ultimately, I feel that we are mostly paying for time. In the sales roles, it's completely different. They're highly compensated on commission. So there's a different thing going on there. But for most other roles that aren't being paid on commission, we're mostly paying them for their time. I say mostly because we also have a certain amount of output expectations. And so we believe that if someone is currently putting in 5.5 hours a day and they're able to produce as much as someone else putting in 8 hours, that they should probably be putting in a 7-hour day and way out producing their colleagues. And in so doing, we have means of recognizing that through our existing talent and promotion system, right? People can get a better bonus, they can move up in terms of their title, they can advance their career. So there are mechanisms we have for recognizing people that they're outperforming, just like pretty much every company does.
Mhm.
Um, but but basically we are in this situation now where when we combine the time with the tasks, we can start to identify, both to your point, to your question, where people are spending their time, but also how effective that is. Essentially, imagine you've got someone working 2 hours of their day performing task A and 6 hours of their day performing task B, and we can actually see how many of tasks A and B they perform. We can divide the time by that, and we end up with time per
Right.
task. And now we can start to really have interesting conversations and insights about where we have higher and lower efficiency. And our chief commercial officer, one of the things he's after, and we've done some of this work. There's still a lot more to go, but as the head of sales and operations, he wants to know which of our clients are more and less time consuming and whether or not we're being compensated adequately for that. Right. So we know that it is actually true. It's not just a make-believe story that sales says, oh, that client is really difficult to deal with compared to that client. There are actually differences. And now we're starting to get to some measures. We say, for this client, look how much less productive in terms of, tasks per hour this one is versus this one. And then you dig in and you have those conversations. You're like, oh, they have to do so many more steps for this client than they do for this client. And, ultimately, our chief commercial officer thinks that should produce differentiated pricing,
Mhm.
right? To align how much effort does that client sort of demand of us, that probably requires a different level of compensation if they're taking more time and effort.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've done, a bit of around the world at Echo. We've got a finance use case here that obviously is really focused on that headcount utilization. You've got a great commercial example here, which is time invested per account. Is that checking
Mhm.
out? Of course, we have you sitting in your seat in data and analytics. Any other key leaders in that organization where if we kind of went around the table, you feel like is getting value out of this type of data that we've left out?
Um, I would say, it's interesting. We initially did a pilot, as you know,
Mhm.
your audience doesn't know. So we started with just 75 people, and we ran that for a long time just to get basic insights. And, we revealed some stuff we didn't know. And so we grew it to a larger group, up to about 150 people. And once we started seeing that, some of the insights we got basically led us to saying, you know what, we really need to go, big with all of this. And the reason why I'm saying this to answer your question is that even though we went big and we've got 2,000 licenses now, and so basically all individual contributors across sort of our sales and operations groups have this, we still had some other units that didn't deploy it. And what's
Mhm.
been happening is they're seeing the insight that the other operational leaders are getting, and they've raised their hand and said, hey, can we get that too? So, like, just specifically, for example, our Mexico operations team is sort of its own unit. And the president of Echo Mexico, came to us last month and was like, hey, can I get my folks on that? I feel like these other leaders are getting really good insights. And so, we added them and set them up. So I don't know if I call it a different use case, but there is an interesting sort of organic growth that's been happening a bit across some additional departments as we continue to see the insights that this is generating the benefit.
Fantastic. That's great. And I know, Megan, you mentioned that we might, leave some space and room for questions. What I'd love to ask you before we go there, Scott, is, here at ActivTrak, we've got a lot of different customers, different industries, different sizes. And I can say pretty confidently that not everybody has a Scott, right? So, I'm curious when we think about, you know, smaller organizations or organizations of larger size but less bandwidth or dedication to these types of use cases, where you'd really encourage people to get the most amount of value with a maybe a limited amount of time or a limited number of resources.
Yeah.
Curious your thoughts there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, not to be uh, too overtly complimentary of your product on this event, your dashboarding is actually really good. And I tend to be pretty critical of dashboarding, and your dashboarding is really good. And I say that because without need, so we've got a whole integration with your raw data. We're moving data into our environment from ActivTrak. We use the ActiveConnect API. It's like we're using sort of advanced cases. But if you don't have all of that, you don't have that capability, you're just using the out-of-the-box reporting, you can get to a lot of great insights pretty quickly. And just to give you one example that didn't require anything fancy, is that on that pilot, on those first 75 people, we just deployed it on operations staff.
Mhm.
And it turned out that they were spending 43% of their day in email. That, just that one insight was actually quite profound because I knew, I'll just tell you, it surprised me. Like I knew email was going to be a heavy part of people's day, but that 43% was easily twice as big as I thought it was. And I think it was also surprising to a lot of other leaders. So you say, okay, well, what do I do about that insight? Well, one of the things we've started tackling, especially with all of the hot topic of AI, is how can we use AI to help us as like email assistants to try to make some of that email action more productive. And we have put a lot more energy into email-based efficiency than we had a couple years ago. And it really stemmed out of that first insight of, holy cow, like almost half of their time is being spent in email. And
Baseline.
so
Yeah.
because we spend all this time building technology for our core systems,
Hmm.
but when you actually look at our proprietary systems, the irony is in terms of how much time it takes up in their day, it's less than half of their day are actually spent in the proprietary systems that we build.
Hmm.
And so what are we doing about all the other systems? You
Hmm.
know? And so so my point is that that doesn't take a lot of complex interaction to see something like that. All it takes is a pilot with the first set of people, and then looking at the dashboards because
Yeah.
it kind of
And
jumps
out of
off the page.
curiosity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
The other thing I do want to point out is that you talked about having this deployed across a lot of different industries. Hopefully, I'm not signing you up for too much, but you provided some benchmarking to us that I found extremely valuable and I brought to our leadership. So it's one thing to say how many, productive hours per day are people putting in general across the whole ActivTrak universe, but different industries have different sort of industry cultures. And it was incredibly helpful to know for the other folks that are in our industry, what do those average numbers look like? And I know you guys don't reveal anything specific about any company, but when you
Hmm.
aggregate, we can actually see like just what's on average true in our industry and look at how our numbers compare. That's really, really helpful. I
Yeah.
also thought of one last thing I want to point out. There is a use case that I thought of that I hadn't mentioned, which is an HR use case. So and this is new for us. We were historically only using the productivity KPIs in
Hmm.
our sort of performance conversations with employees. But we are now bringing in ActivTrak, not as the primary, but as a supporting piece of information of saying, here, you're not doing enough tasks. And what we can see clearly is you're not putting in essentially full-time work. So clearly there's a relationship there. And that becomes part of like when it's necessary, the performance conversation. So there's an HR use case that we haven't really talked about um, that is going to start like coming about that's engaged in this. And it's not,
For that coaching and
yeah, it's not the
coaching. Yeah.
primary, but I think it's going to add a whole new layer of insight to those conversations, especially in hybrid work environments. And that's where things can be really challenging. And we see, most folks put in like relatively the same hours on in our world, it's mostly Monday, Friday are work from home, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is in the office.
Mhm.
Most people, it's basically the same. And then you have, out of 3,000 employees, it's not that surprising that you can find a subset of people who have very different hours on Mondays and Fridays than they do on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so, it's easier to see
A
that.
lot of the time is re-expectation setting or driving that policy more in place, right? Or holding
Right.
managers accountable to drive the policy more in place. So,
That's right.
well, excellent. I want to be respectful of time, Megan. If you want to throw us one question, just so we can honor the commitment,
Yes,
that'd be
I,
great.
I would I would love to. Yes, we will do one question here while we're answering that question. I did want to pop up a poll. Just I wanted to see, this is one of the first times we've done a session like that. I would really like this. I would really like to know if people like this session, if they have ideas for other types of topics that they want to hear from. So if we can go ahead and we'll go ahead and pop up that poll while we also cover this question. So one of our people in the audience asked, "What are your favorite reports to check productivity across the different departments?"
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there is a productivity overview where you can see the total productive hours, unproductive hours, undefined hours in a series of bar graphs, and you can see that back through days. Um, that's usually the first thing I go to when I'm looking at someone, just as an overview. Then you can drop into the top websites and the top applications, and you can sort of see where their time is being spent. And so, for example, on a core sales rep, which is one of our sort of like newer sales rep, we expect them to be spending a lot of time in Salesforce, which is our, sort of lead system. Do we see that, or are they spending time, in a bunch of other stuff? So those are mostly under the live reports if you're looking on the left-hand column of the ActivTrak dashboard. Um, and I find those to be some of the first places I go to dig in on what's happening with an
Which
individual,
every customer has access to, which
which
is
every customer has
fantastic.
access to.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Amazing. Okay. Well, to close this out, do you have any words of wisdom that you'd like to share with anyone who has joined us today?
More words of wisdom, Scott.
More words
More
of
words of
wisdom. Yes. Thank
wisdom.
you for that. Yes.
Yeah, I would say, I just think being transparent and being open-minded and being fair uh, are the ways that this measurement ultimately enhances the company, your firm, and ensures that you don't go down this sort of like, darker path of corporate overlords. I think there's a very, very positive message to be had and use in utility of this information. And I think it's going to be, I know it's already being incredibly powerful and helpful at our company, but you do want to go into it with the right mindset, which is this is about, having the needs of the firm and the needs of the employees aligned, and that, expectations are clear and being met. And if you do that, you should have a good workforce, a good culture, and a high performance company.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Gabriella. Appreciate both of your time and expertise. And to everyone in the audience, thanks so much for your participation. And we will send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording so you can check it out and listen to it again, and hear those great insights that Scott shared. And of course, we will have another session in a few weeks. So be on the lookout for an invitation to that. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your
Fantastic.
week.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Thanks,
You're
everyone.
welcome.